Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the second session. I'm Paul Kett. I'm Director General for Higher Education and Further Education at the Department for Education, and formerly a CSaP Fellow of a few years ago now. I look at Rob to work out that was a fair few years ago. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you this afternoon. And I missed the end of the last session, but I arrived to hear a tremendous buzz and lots of questions in the room, and I thought, wonderful, CSaP is back to doing what it's best at, of getting dialogue going, debates, and it's so wonderful to be doing it in person, although not quite on the same scale as the usual annual gig. But this afternoon, I'm incredibly proud to be chairing a panel with some wonderful experts on child development, learning, and mental health. And in a similar way to the previous session, we'll have some opening remarks from my panelists, take a few questions, and open it up to the floor for thoughts, reflections, challenges, and provocations in the usual way, and we'll have a bit of a conversation. If I can say a brief word about my brilliant panelists. So we have Professor Tamsin Ford, Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge, an internationally renowned child psychiatric epidemiologist who looks particularly at the effectiveness of services and interventions for children and young people's mental health. We also have the wonderful Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, Professor of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and leader of the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience Group, focusing particularly on social cognition and decision-making in the human adolescent brain. Though one of the things I was particularly pleased to see in Sarah-Jayne's previous publications was a book on the secret life of the teenage brain, and I think any insights that help us understand teenage life must be valuable, if slightly nerve-wracking. So there we go. So I'll invite the panelists to sort of say a few words of, in terms of introduction to kick us off, and then we'll get the Q&A going. And I think, Sarah-Jayne, you're going to start us off, so over to you.
Yeah. Ooh, that's working. Okay, yes. So I'm going to talk to you for just a few minutes. In fact, I must keep an eye on time so I don't ramble on, about the adolescent brain. That's what I work on, and that's what my group works on. So just to give a little bit of background, I wasn't always interested in the adolescent brain. I did a PhD here in London and then a postdoc in France, both on schizophrenia, which, as you may know, is a psychiatric condition that's characterized by horrible symptoms like hearing voices inside your head and being really paranoid, thinking that other people are out to get you. And so I spent about 6 years working on the cognitive neuroscience of schizophrenia, and I just became interested in the fact that whenever I asked a patient, when did you start experiencing these symptoms, there wasn't a single exception. Of all the hundreds of patients I tested in hospitals, they all said at some age between 18 and about 26. And I thought this was really intriguing. What is it about teenage brain development that is different in teenagers who go on to develop schizophrenia compared with those who don't? And at the time, that was in the early 2000s, that I became interested in that question. Reading the scientific literature, to my surprise, I found that almost nothing was known back then about the development of the teenage brain in humans. We just didn't know anything at all. And that made sense because, in fact, before that, during my undergraduate degree, I remember being taught that the brain stops developing in childhood. That's what I was taught. Turns out that's completely wrong. And we now know that the brain undergoes very substantial and protracted development right throughout childhood, of course, and throughout adolescence and even into early adulthood. So adolescence, these days, we define it as the period of life between 10 and 24. So it's a very protracted period of development, and it's really a unique period of psychological and social and biological development. Now, when I say adolescents or even teenagers, you might think, well, that's a kind of recent phenomenon, this idea that, we have this extended period of development. It wasn't always like that. And the stereotypical behaviours that we associate with that age group, you might think, oh, that's just a kind of recent Western phenomenon. In fact, that's not the case. And if you look back at historical descriptions of adolescence, you see striking similarities with the way we stereotypically think about them today. So I've written a couple of quotes down, one from Socrates. So over 2,000 years ago, Socrates spoke a lot about youth. And he said things like, he was very negative about youth. And he said things like, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders, and love chatter in the place of exercise. And he, went on and on like that. Aristotle, too, wrote a lot about youth and said things like they're passionate, irascible, they're apt to be carried away by their impulses. So throughout history, and since then, you know, in Shakespeare and many other historical descriptions of this age group, you see the same strikingly similar negative stereotypes picking up on these kind of slightly negative behaviours that we associate with this age group, like laziness and selfishness and making bad decisions. Okay, so that's nothing new. What is new is our knowledge about brain development during this period of life. Like I said, when I did my undergraduate degree, there was nothing known about, and until, in fact, 20 years ago, really, there was nothing known about how the human brain changes during adolescence. We now know that the human brain changes very dramatically during adolescence. And we know that because we have the ability to scan the living human brain using MRI scanning. So MRI scanning, you may know, it gives you these very beautiful, quite high-resolution pictures, photographs of the inside of your brain and your body, and we use it to measure both brain structure and brain function, and we can track how those two things change across the lifespan. So, for example, one area of one measurement of brain structure that we take and we look at how it changes is white matter volume. So white matter is mostly found in the center of your brains, and it contains the long fibers that connect up different regions of the brain together and allow different regions of the brain to communicate with each other. Now, white matter increases very substantially, linearly, throughout childhood, adolescence, and into early adulthood, even into the 30s. And the reason why white matter, as viewed by MRI, increases throughout adolescence and into early adulthood is for a few reasons, but mostly because those tracts, those fibers that make up white matter, are growing in diameter and also being covered in a white fatty substance called myelin. And that's all I'm going to say about that neurophysiology, but the main point here is that as those two things happen, axons grow in diameter, the fibers grow in diameter and become covered with myelin, the speed of neuronal transmission increases. So in other words, more white matter means the brain is working faster. And that is happening throughout adolescence. At the same time that white matter is increasing, grey matter is decreasing. So grey matter is mostly found in the cortex, the surface of the brain, and contains things like neuronal cell bodies and synapses, the connections between cells. And what grey matter does is, in your brains, it increases during childhood. It's highest in late childhood, and then it undergoes a very substantial decline during adolescence and stabilizes into around the mid-20s in most cortical regions. And that decline in grey matter volume, that sounds like a bad thing in adolescence. In fact, we think of it as a really important neurodevelopmental process whereby through a developmental process called synaptic pruning, whereby excess synapses that are not being used are pruned away, they're eliminated, that allows the brain to be shaped and moulded by the environment that a child or an adolescent is in. So all of those neurophysiological processes I've mentioned, axonal growth, myelination, and synaptic pruning, are mechanisms of neuroplasticity, whereby the brain adapts according to environmental input. And we think of adolescence as a sensitive period of brain development, which confers both opportunity for learning and intervention, but also vulnerability to environmental stress, for example. And in the last few seconds, I just want to say that at the same time that the brain is developing, so is the mind. So the regions of the brain that develop latest are the regions like prefrontal cortex that are responsible for things like decision-making and planning and self-awareness and working memory and self-control and understanding other people. All of those things also undergo a very large amount of development during adolescence, as does things like creativity. There's evidence that adolescents are more creative than adults, and risk-taking and peer influence. All of that change, on top of, which I haven't even mentioned, the hormonal changes that are happening in early adolescence, it allows the young person to become gradually an independent adult. That's what the whole point of adolescence is, to emerge the other end as an independent adult. But at the same time, all those transitions and changes places new pressures on the developing individual. And I think that's one of the reasons why all these changes, biological, psychological, and social, renders this period of life a period of vulnerability for mental illness. And that's what Tamsin is going to talk about.
Thank you, Sarah. My toes are just about uncurled from the introduction, and I can certainly recommend Sarah-Jayne's books. They're fabulous. She writes beautifully, and they're very readable, particularly Inventing Ourselves, which is my favourite. So I am an accidental professor. I went to medical school, trained as a doctor, went into psychiatry because I really wanted to. It was the bit of medicine that really enthused me. I loved my training as a psychiatrist. I did my postgraduate initial training out in the East End of London, which is a really vibrant, exciting community to be part of, with, refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants from all over the world, but particularly from Somalia and Bangladesh at the time. And then I came across to train in child and adolescent psychiatry at the Maudsley Hospital, and was exposed for the first time, really, I think, in my training to really high-quality research. And I kind of thought most research was a bit tedious, really, if I was honest, and not really, I wanted to, save the world. But actually being exposed to really high-quality research and national clinics with people who are absolute experts in a particular condition, and seeing what that knowledge could do over the course of the 3 years of training, really made me understand the importance of research and evidence. But I thought, you're all answering the wrong questions. There's so much we need to know about how we can help people. So through that, I took a 6-month research job. I never went back, and it took a remarkably long time to work out that actually I was an academic. So that's my background. So I worked for the NHS as a psychiatrist probably for nearly a decade. And, I miss the clinical world a little bit. But in terms of research, there are 3 points that I want to make. First of all, I think we have a real problem with language. And from the very best of intentions, we tie ourselves up in complete and absolute knots. So you will have all heard people saying, well, my cousin or my sister or my friend has mental health. And actually, what they mean is mental illness. We all have mental health. So when I talk about mental health, what I mean is the totality of the spectrum of how you can be psychologically, going from absolutely thriving and everything's going really, really well, which we hopefully all experience a little bit of the time, to the other end where people have an impairing condition that is getting in the way of their function. And at that point, I think what we are talking about, we might not want to call it illness, but I think using the term health, which is about trying to destigmatize, I guess, but actually what it does is rob people who are really suffering and really impaired from a language to describe what they're feeling. It also nibbles away at the other end of the spectrum because we're using the same word in a way that's just not precise. So whether you want to call call it psychological distress, whether you want to call it a mental health condition. I think, that we could talk for a whole hour about what makes a mental health condition. And I think the reason we get into this with mental health far more than we do with other types of health is the fact that, again, we use the same words. We use the word anxiety to mean what I was certainly feeling before this started, a little bit, I hope I don't make an idiot of myself, which is totally normal. And actually it's healthy. Psychologists have done experiments showing that actually your performance increases for a bit as your stress goes up. It's just if the stress overwhelms you, then your performance rapidly falls off. So that's a normal experience, and that's about your body preparing you to deal with the stress, and it's useful and it's adaptive. If, on the other hand, you are so anxious that you are vomiting several times a day, you can't keep food down, you maybe don't even want to eat because you feel so wretched, you can't get into school, you can't listen in lessons or in your job, at that point, I don't think anyone would argue that that person has a serious problem. And there's a bit of a fuzzy bit in between, which will be about the biological aspects of the individual, what genes they've inherited, some tendencies. Most psychological conditions have lots of genes, not a single one that caused them. But some of us are more prone to get anxious than others. Some of us are more prone to lose our tempers or find it hard to control our emotions than others. So your genetics plays into it. So does your social situation, and so does your psychological well-being, your psychological makeup. So if you are a child with special educational needs, you will find school a harder environment to be if your needs are not adequately met. Whereas if you're very bright, it's probably not a lot of effort to deal with. And that's why you get that fuzzy border between what is very definitely a mental health condition and what, most of us are not thriving all the time. Most of us are in the middle where, there are some things that are not right and could be a bit better in most of our lives, but actually we're probably doing mostly all right most of the time. And so that's one big point I wanted to make. The next big point I wanted to make is there's been an awful lot in the press about the mental health of our young people. And I've actually been involved. The first job I took, I think probably because I was respected as a clinician, not an academic, was doing the clinical rating for the first national survey. So 10,500 young people from the age of 5 to 15. Their parents were interviewed. If they were over 11, the young people were interviewed. And if the family agreed, a questionnaire went to teachers. And that was all put together and rated by 2 clinical raters supervised by one other person. There was 10,500 children because they over-recruited. We should be so proud of these surveys. They're the only ones in the world that are single phase in that every single child got the diagnostic assessment. And also the assessment that was used took all the best bits of different ways of doing it and put them all together. So that survey happened in 1999. There was another one in 2004, and then there was one in 2017. And it didn't show the tsunami of mental health conditions that were reported in the press, but it did show a significant deterioration amongst our school-age population, so the 5 to 15-year-olds, which was the age group that we had in all 3 surveys. Interestingly, this last survey went down to the age of 2, and it went up to the age of 19. And actually that crossover is really helpful because from the adult mental health surveys, which start at the age of 16, from both surveys we're getting a really strong signal that our older teenagers and those in their early 20s are doing really badly at the moment. So in the adults it was 2014, and in the child survey it's 2017. And we have managed to go back to the children's survey last summer and this spring, and what we showed, a lot's happened in 3 years. We can't say for definite that it was the pandemic, but that seems to be the biggest change. We've gone from 1 in 9 with a probable mental health condition. So in your average class of 30, that's sort of 3, maybe 4 young people who have an impairing mental health condition. We've gone from 1 in 9 to 1 in 6 in 2020, and that has stayed. So those figures are really quite frightening, and it's being mirrored with lots more urgent and emergency presentations for eating disorders. So our services are buckling under this strain. So let's think about mental health in the continuum, particularly in the education sector. There's lots we can do to help people look after their mental health. We should be worried about our young people. There is evidence of a deterioration that the pandemic and the restrictions relating to it may well have exacerbated. And a further point I wanted to make is there is also evidence that the outcomes in terms of education, health, and behaviours that jeopardise health, like smoking, drinking, diet, exercise, those outcomes are worse in recent cohorts, and that's been shown from childhood to adolescence in the Millennium cohort compared to the Ausbach cohort born in the early 1990s and the 1970s birth cohort. And then it was shown between 1958 and the 1970s birth cohort from adolescence to adulthood. And I guess if we wait a few more years, we'll be able to do it with the Millennium cohort as well. So more young people with worse mental health, and the impact of that poor mental health is worse for them. Which brings me to the very last thing I want to say, which is we have lots of evidence-based either interventions for those who need help, and there are a few interventions that could be used universally to help build resilience. They won't have big effects, but actually, when you're doing okay and you're just a bit wobbly, a little change in a trajectory at, say, 8 or 9 can work out to a big difference because of the cascading effect you get. If you're really anxious and unable to concentrate for 3 to 6 months, that maybe is 2 terms out of a school year, and the consequences that come from that then stack risks on top. So we shouldn't underestimate what we can do, but it needs to be evidence-based. That there's a lot of rubbish out there, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you, Sarah-Jayne. Huge amount in that. And one question I'll pose before I open it up to the floor, which is to try and link us back into the sort of implications for policymakers as we're here in sort of CSaP. Though before I do, I think we'll all sort of suddenly view Harry Enfield and Kevin the Teenager in a different light, inspired by Socrates. And I think that's part of an interesting story of making assumptions about our knowledge in a kind of current context. And on the broader resilience point, I think, Tamsin, your points on the pandemic, I think we've all seen and have huge admiration for the resilience that children and young people have shown through this pandemic. But of course, we all see the worsening picture in terms of what we're seeing reported in terms of mental health at all levels. And so I think that challenge is one we all share. So we're here in CSaP thinking about the connection of your research to policymakers. And so I think I heard a theme between both of you around sort of opportunity and vulnerability to young people thriving, whether that's in terms of where they are in development or how their mental health is reporting, whether that's from thriving in terms of performance or vulnerability through stress or whatever it may be. What's your sort of key message for sort of policymakers, whether in education, health, levelling up the previous sort of seminar in terms of wider links to deprivation? What do you think the kind of key takeaways for policymakers should be? Who wants to kick us off?
Prevention is better than cure. I think, we should be thinking really hard about how we support, even before school, particularly parenting. Advice with parenting, supporting with parenting. You have no control over who comes to live with you. And if you're really lucky...
That'd be a radical policy option.
Well, you have no control. So there's this wonderful book which I recommend quite a lot to parents called Toddler Taming. And, the paediatrician who wrote it sort of says, well, some parents are lucky, they score an angel. And, one of my friends did, she has a daughter who, you could just tell her once, to stop doing something. Not only would she stop instantly, but she would never, ever do it again. And I used to look at this child and just think, you're so unnatural. It certainly wasn't like mine. But, most of us could do a lot of with a little help and guidance, because pretty much everybody wants their children to do well. And yet what we are seeing, if you listen to teachers who teach very little children, and I can see it in the village that I live in, is parents pick up their child with their looking at their mobile phone. There's a toddler in a buggy looking away from the parents, and nobody's talking. You know, nobody's, and children are coming into schools with worse language skills. And again, that will, there's probably a socioeconomic differentiation between that just aggravates the gap, because language is so key. Whereas, things that encourage parents to speak to their children, to sing with their children, to play word games, all the things that promote language would be really, helpful and help schools. And then, thinking about what we can do in schools to promote life skills, so being able to say how you feel, identify your emotions, learn to control your emotions, problem solving, conflict resolution. These are skills that whatever you do will be very useful.
Thank you. And very interesting on the early language acquisition in particular, because from an education point of view, I think all education policymakers would very much recognise the importance of that from an education point of view, but not necessarily the link into mental health. So thank you. Sarah-Jayne.
I mean, there's lots I could say, but I'll and I promised Rob that I wouldn't do a GCSE rant, but I'll do a minor GCSE rant. So, okay, so successive governments have paid lip service to the mental health crisis in young people, and they say they want to do something about it. That's something you hear about a lot at the moment. But if you ask young people in their kind of mid-teens, what are you stressed by? I mean, Tamsin knows the data on this much better than I do. I've just read it from things that Tamsin has written. If you ask young people, what stresses you out, what gets you down, they say, in all these huge surveys, they say exam stress and academic pressure and fear of failure. It's just unequivocal that is a massive source of stress for young people. So if governments want to tackle the mental health crisis, well, one really, it's very, very complex, but that's actually quite a simple change that could be made. Reduce academic pressure and exam stress. GCSEs, well, they were brought in the late 80s when, as I've already said, nothing was known about brain development during adolescence. I think the new science on brain development during adolescence and cognitive development is really relevant to how we think about the best way to educate young people and assess young people. The GCSEs were brought in many years before we knew anything about how the brain changes during the teenage years. And now that we do know that, perhaps we should reassess whether this is really the optimal way to assess the potential and the attainment of young people. And, in contrast to that, GCSEs have become more linear, more in terms of the number of exams young people have to do, and more pressure to rote learn masses of information, which squeezes out the natural propensity of teenagers to be creative and to explore and do novel things and take risks. And actually, the rote learning, that's a whole other area of science which is quite a lot is known about. Rote learning is not the best way, as we all know, to retain information in the longer term. Rote learning helps you in the very short term for an exam, and then a few days later you've forgotten it all. So I think GCSEs is one area where this new science does have implications. Not just GCSEs, but the whole of the whole of assessment during the primary and secondary school years. So that's one example in education.
Thank you. And open up to the floor. I'll take a couple of questions at a time. So, lady just here, and if you don't mind introducing yourself as well. Oh, and there is a microphone running there.
Thank you. I'm Tara Alice from McKinsey. Also, thank you so much for incredibly inspiring and thoughtful presentations and talks. I'm going to have to go and find all those books and read them. And thank you also for the policy recommendations. My question is around the curriculum. It strikes me, I studied in Finland, so not relevant to this, but I studied engineering and then I've actually practiced as an economist. And I know a ton about how the universe works and how quantum mechanics works and how computers work. I have had to learn since adulthood how people work, emotions, social connection. You hopefully learn that through practice. But actually, would it be helpful for teenagers or even children to be taught conceptually, first of all, like how the brain works, how emotions work, how neurotransmitters work, how all that stuff comes together and why you react in certain ways, or why other people react in certain ways and why they feel certain things, etc. And then, back to Tamsin's point, would it be helpful for the curriculum to include some really practical emotional intelligence style learning? Because I would have thought that that's way more important than stuff you can Google in a second. If I needed to know how, quantum computing works, I really can Google that in a second, but none of that stuff that you've talked about can be learned online.
Thank you. And the gentleman just here, and if I can add to Tara's question on, one of the things you said, Sarah-Jayne, was it was obviously a relatively new field in terms of the brain development. So I'd sort of say, not only what do we need to think about in terms of the curriculum, but actually what do we all need to be educated and understand on brain development. So, sir. Oh, sorry.
A couple of slightly disparate questions, if I may. It's Peter Parker. I used to be at the FCA, but they happily paid me a lot of money to disappear. The first is one of the features of the last 10, 20 years has been drastic cuts in youth services and youth facilities. And I wonder whether that maps onto or provides any connections or thoughts as to why, because those are forms of remedial contact that could ameliorate adolescent stresses. And I wonder if there are any links there. And the second is to do with this curriculum point, because rote learning isn't confined to GCSEs. It is also hoop jumping, absolutely prevalent in A-levels. And if you ever have a tutor or anything of that sort for your child, the first thing they tell you is, I know the mark scheme. And teachers universally at GCSEs and A-levels teach to the marking scheme. And that completely is a differentiator from A-levels when I was doing them, when nobody knew the mark scheme. And the system worked because, by and large, A-levels were marked, texts were marked by academics of one sort or another. Of course, the main consumers for A-levels are universities. So it has always mystified me why universities don't take back control of A-levels if they want to have people who are trained to do more than jump through hoops.
Thank you. If I encourage colleagues to focus on, we've got brilliant panellists in terms of brain development and mental health. So I will obviously take those questions, but wider education policy might be an area we want to veer slightly away from and focus more on, if I may, generally. I mean, obviously, welcome to, but
as a neuroscientist, I'm totally happy to go there.
So, in no way constraining the panel, don't worry. So, Sarah-Jayne, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, yes, I think it's a real shame that, we now know quite a lot about how teenagers' brains are changing and how their cognition is changing, but it's not something that they often learn about at school. And yet it's their brains, and actually might be quite useful for them to know how things are changing and how it's a biological process and it takes time and things will settle down no matter how turbulent things might seem. Some schools include, a couple of lessons on it, but it's not on any curriculum, even in biology. GCSE or even A-level, actually. But yes, and you talk about social emotional learning. It's a really interesting one. I think about it a lot. And you have to be, so I'm not going to answer that question directly. I'm just going to tell you that one other area of policy implication of this research is in interventions and what interventions work best for teenagers. And the general finding so far is that young people respond better to peer-led intervention. So, for example, there's a study a few years ago in the USA on anti-bullying interventions in schools. So they took a large number of schools, they split them randomly into two groups. In half the group of schools, these are middle schools, so age 11 to 15-year-olds, they carried out their anti-bullying campaigns as normal, led by teachers. In the other half, the students themselves were educated about the harmful effects of bullying and social exclusion, and then they were incentivized to lead their own campaigns, so like wristband campaigns, poster campaigns, debates, parties, that kind of thing. In those schools where the anti-bullying campaigns were led by the students, there was a 25% reduction in bullying incidents in the following year compared with the control schools where the anti-bullying campaigns were led by adults. And I think there's something to, and that absolutely fits with what we know about teenagers being very concerned about their friends' views, not wanting to be socially excluded by their friends, being very influenced by their peers. And I think, that is quite telling in terms of what's important for young people and how to. It's difficult to imagine social emotional learning lessons where you kind of teach young people how to, adults coming in saying you have to do this now in this social situation, but maybe encouraging them to create their own interventions, lessons in that area could be constructive. I've got other things to say on that. Maybe I'll come back to that later because Tamsin needs to come in. But just on the rote learning thing, I completely agree. I mean, the mark scheme, creativity is something that we really want to capitalise on, this natural propensity to be creative when you're young. And yet the mark scheme, it's like someone's invented something to eradicate creativity, because it doesn't allow for any creativity or any lateral thinking or independent conceptual argument. That doesn't get any marks. You have to stick with exactly what you're told. So I completely agree, even though I don't know anything about education policy really, but it's something that I think about a lot. And one last thing there is that a sort of related tangentially point is about siloed subject areas. We silo subject areas really young in our education system. Not so much in primary school actually, where the same theme will be learnt about, whether it's boats or whatever, will be learnt about across art, math, science, history. As soon as you reach secondary school, that is either physics or science or history or geography, when in fact that's a completely artificial distinction. And I like thinking about, again, a sort of thought experiment, what would secondary education look like if we didn't have those siloed subjects? Thank you,
Sarah-Jayne. Tamsin.
Okay, so if we start with, what should we be doing? I totally agree. I think the peer-led programs with teenagers seem to be the way to go. The other thing at secondary level is that people are becoming a bit more self-aware, but also we shouldn't expect a universal program that's given to everybody to have a huge impact, and actually maybe there's ways of personalising a bit. So there is some really interesting early work by a clinical psychologist called Patricia Conroy from Canada, who tailored a program to advise children about the risks they personally face from drugs and alcohol by doing a personality test initially and splitting them into the sort of shy, anxious, inhibited kids who might be more at risk of ending up completely comatose because they sat at the corner swinging back because they were anxious and shy and didn't know what to do, or that you start coping like that and you find it's an answer to your problems and it's not really in the longer term, as opposed to the more impulsive, sensation-seeking, risk-taking youngsters who face a different array of personal challenges. And actually it's one of the programs that does show an impact. But I also think we need to think about this pre-adolescence. And there are, whether you call them resilience programs or prevention programs, there are a number of programs that help children from a very young age to identify the emotions they're feeling, which is the first step to being able to understand and decide to act on them. It doesn't matter if people get angry. Emotions are there for a reason, but it does matter if you then knock someone's teeth out. you need to be, I'm aware I'm getting angry, that's not good, do I need to go and cool down, or do I need to explain to somebody why they're making me, how can I solve this problem? And many of these programs will have an element of emotional identification and learning to regulate yourself, but also with an element of problem solving, and particularly around social conflict. And, we have a huge bullying problem in this country. It will happen in all schools from time to time, but we're not very good at dealing with it. Most schools have a bullying policy. They'll tell you about it proudly, but if you ask them where it is, they often can't lay their hands on it. Which suggests that it's not terribly thoroughly implemented. And yet there are evidence-based programs. So, for example, Kiva in Finland, which is a program that starts at age 8 and goes through to middle of adolescence, sort of mid-teens, sort of to go with the middle school system that they have there, is all about a whole school approach, helping people not be a bystander, making it unacceptable to be a bystander, but also about how you solve disagreements with people and how you solve a problem and how you negotiate, which are all key skills that we all need. And I love the idea of having some lessons on the brain. And I was thinking, I did A-level biology, and I certainly remember drawing a neuron and knowing that the brain was in your skull, but I don't think we did anything else at all. Which it's sad, because the brain is the most exciting organ, and we know so much more about it now. So then I think I will not say any more than that on the curriculum, because it's really not my area of expertise. So I hope. What was your other question? Youth services. Well, I think to be sure it was causal, we would have to run a rather dodgy randomised controlled trial, which I don't think would get past the ethics committee, rightly so, where one area got the youth services and the other area didn't.
Your hypotheses, I think, are allowed.
Well, I think it depends on the quality. Certainly there is evidence that Sure Start centres, which were sources of support for families, younger families, over the time they've been thought to reduce things that were not directly related to what they were doing, like admissions to hospital and accidents and things. And I think, somewhere to go that is safe to explore socially is really important. We don't want people, sitting in their own homes on their own, perhaps glued to a phone if they've got one. We want youngsters to be out constructively engaged, whether that's doing something creative, like drama or music or sport, and we want them moving around, frankly, as well. We have a problem with obesity, which is not great for health and not great for mental health either. I wouldn't say it's definitely causal, but it certainly won't be helping.
Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you, Sarah-Jayne. And really interested in that link between the sort of personalisation of the intervention, as you described, and what you said earlier on prevention. I think too often the personalisation is coming at the end, and at the very expensive end of intervention, but opportunities to intervene further upstream. Thank you. Okay, let's take another couple of questions. The gentleman in the grey top there, and then the lady on the right.
Terrible on microphones. So Ben Adams, currently with DLUC, as we've heard about previously. But I was a secondary school teacher, secondary science teacher, until 3 years ago. So I would just like to say that in a lot of schools, a lot of stuff does happen. I have personally taught lessons on the brain and brain development. It's not in the curriculum, but context is, that's what we try to do. But my question is, and I could answer almost every question here with my own point of view, but I won't. It's to do with the internet and online and social media with young people and their development in that way. So you've got some countries that are dealing with very strange ways. China, for example, have just banned all young people from accessing online gaming for more than 3 hours a week. And personally, I've seen it having both a really negative and a really positive effect on teenagers when they're going through some of the most stressful times. I was just wondering, there doesn't seem to be much real... Should we be doing something about this now, about social media and young people? Should we be focusing on this? Because it's going to be a fact of their life. They need to, Yeah.
Thank you. And actually, this gentleman here had his hand up as well, so if we take that question as well, and then we'll come to you and we'll do three. So,
actually, I wanted to bring... Sorry, it's just a question to bring both Tamsin and Sarah-Jayne's perspectives together, actually. So, sorry, I'm Alistair Smith, I'm from DFE, and I'm not going to ask about the curriculum at all, or exams. If we now understand brain development, that's great, but actually I would suggest that nothing has changed about the way that the brain develops over time. But actually we have seen a change in the prevalence of mental health illnesses. If we're talking about preventive work, if it's not about the individual brain development, what are the sort of cultural, structural issues that we might be able to address that could help us unpick some of the pressures on young people today? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. And then the lady just here, the black face mask.
Cristina Peñasco, University of Cambridge. It's a kind of follow-up with a former question about social networks. So some weeks ago, there was this big news on the media about a specific social platform in which they were, or the company was, well aware of the negative impacts of the use of this social network, particularly in young women. So is it a possibility that we will be facing a society more prone to stress and mental health issues because of the level of exposition of teenagers and early young adults to this type of information and social networks? If that is the case, what could be the consequences of that for public health system and for the future mental health of societies in general? And echoing the former question, is there something that we can do from a policy perspective to solve these issues? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we take the sort of prevalence of mental health and wider context first, and then those two questions on the online impact second. Tamsin, do you want to kick off on the prevalence?
Yes. So I think it's a big question, one that I've spent the last 20 years thinking about. I have a colleague who actually we did our PhDs together at King's College London, but he's now in Cardiff, who has done a lot of work on trends in mental health conditions across different countries and across time and what that might mean. It's extraordinarily difficult to study because, we don't, and I don't think we ever will have, a simple test that you can do that says this, there is always an element of what someone chooses to report on your standardized assessment and how that is interpreted. So we're trying to measure something with a ruler that's sort of doing this. And then, of course, people and attitudes change. If you think about how much more willing we are to talk about mental health now than we were 20 years ago, and that may well impact how people fill in questionnaires. So I was involved in a very interesting study which examined sort of 10 years' worth of data gathered in yearly panels. So these were huge cross-sectional surveys where either a parent or a young person filled in a very brief measure that gave a gave a score in terms of their mental health. Excuse me. And there wasn't any consistent change year on year. It would have been a different sample every year, not the same individuals. There wasn't really any difference in the proportion that seemed to be really struggling. But what did change over 20 years was the willingness of parents or young people to say, I'm worried about my child or I'm worried about my mental health. That said, I think our national surveys, they were done using the same measure, the same methods, and by a lot of the same team. And I was very sceptical, but I think partly because the initial deterioration was small, that reassured me that it wasn't just measurement. So I think we have seen a deterioration. It's too fast to be biological. It won't be anything to do with genes, probably not hormones. So we're talking something social or psychological. And there are a number of things. Social media, to link it back to the, we'll deal with that in a second. I think we have more families living in food insecurity. One of the strongest correlations in our follow-up of the national survey, cross-sectional, so you can't say it's causal, we're measuring both at the same time, but a family that had to use a food bank or wasn't able to meet their bills, very, very strong relationship with both parent and child mental health. Or poor mental health, there I go, misusing the language. I think likewise, exam pressure is something that the young people tell us is a major concern. And also, I think, opportunities to socialise. I sort of do worry when you see everybody down with their heads on phones. But that said, my 2 teenage daughters would tell you that actually often they are interacting, but they're just not in the same room. So I think, there are some very traditional risk factors or predictors of poor mental health. Financial insecurity, poor housing, food insecurity, not having a supportive network, living in a neighbourhood that's plagued by crime, by drugs, where it's difficult and stressful to live. All of that produces a risk. If your parent then is not available to you because of drugs, domestic violence, or their own poor mental health, or sometimes all three. So I think if bringing it back to policy, that actually trying to do our best to make sure everyone has adequate housing, an income they can live on, and adequate food would probably do quite a lot. Then if we can do something about exam pressure and schools get more opportunities to be a bit more creative, and also build better social skills, those soft skills that employers want. I think you can't learn them. You have to experience them and develop them. But I think, the bigger public health things are where we need to start.
Thank you. Sarah-Jayne, do you want to add anything on that, or do you want to pick up the online?
Well, just that I think it was a few years ago, the Millennium Cohort Study, or maybe Understanding Society or something, showed that the biggest risk factor for depression and other mental health problems at age 14, particularly in girls, was poverty. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know, I feel like that, I do understand that it's not simple to correct that, but it is simpler than, say, gene editing.
Yes.
I mean, poverty, we could try to do something about that, and maybe that would improve the mental health of young people overall. So social media, well, yeah, it's a huge, important subject. And, I think someone asked a question, should we worry about it? I think that we really, it's an urgent problem that needs to be looked at. That's not to say that it definitely is causing any increase in mental health problems, but we really urgently need to know, so we need to do the high quality science. And it is starting to be done. One of our colleagues, Amy Orben in Cambridge, works exactly in that area. She really is now one of the experts in the area of the links between social media use and well-being in young people. And I mean, just to summarise very briefly her findings, first of all, there is a tiny, tiny correlation between increased social media use and increased depression in young people, particularly girls. However, it's tiny, and we don't know the direction of causality. It might be that using social media a lot makes you depressed, or it might be that if you're depressed, you use social media more, and we just don't know that from those big correlational studies. What she has shown beyond that is that it's much more nuanced than just, is social media bad? It depends when you're using it. In the middle of the night is not great because that interrupts your sleep, and sleep's very important for mental health and all sorts of other things. It depends what you're looking at, and that's been mentioned already. I mean, there are some really harmful things online, and there are some really positive things online. And it depends how you're using it. So generally what has been found is that young people who actively engage in social media to connect with their friends, their peers, that is actually quite beneficial. Whereas young people who just scroll passively through other people's social media feeds, that's not so beneficial. So it's when you use it, what you're looking at and how you use it. But so it is really critical to to understand. And I think, you know, right now we just don't know. In 10 years' time, we'll probably have a much better idea of the harmful or maybe beneficial effects of social media on young people.
Sobering, thank you. Tamsin, do you want to add a quick word on social media before I try and wrap us up?
Well, all I would say is we really need those longitudinal studies, and you know, if we can prize data to study it out of the companies that are swimming in it and analysing it themselves, that would be hugely useful, because we really don't know. We have almost no longitudinal data, and I suspect it will be for whom is it a risk, and it's like the risk of crossing the road or driving. It's a risk that we will have to skill our young people up to handle, because I can't imagine social media or the digital world going away. So
yeah, exactly.
They need to understand it, they need to be able to use it, and they need to be aware of any risks that may be personal to them or general. So I think it'll be about how to use it safely is where we need to go.
And one thing to add to that is that, you know, you were saying that there is this very worrying crisis that seems to have been aggravated possibly by the pandemic, of more young people self-reporting being having some kind of mental health problem. But still, the majority of young people don't have a mental health problem. And I think that is really important to remember, that the majority of young people are doing okay, and they mostly use social media.
Yeah.
And somehow they manage.
Yeah, 1 in 6 is frightening, but it does mean that 5 in 6 are still doing fine. And, you know, I think, frankly, that's remarkable after the last 2 years.
I know, exactly.
Well, a lovely point to end on. Thank you so much. I won't attempt to sort of summarise, but I will just sort of pull out a couple of, I think, really important insights to take away. I mean, first one, obviously, as being from the Department for Education, lots of challenge on curriculum, exam stress, all of those kind of things, so message loudly heard. I thought really important points on the opportunity around sort of personalisation and better understanding linked to prevention. I think really interesting about how do we use the insights that the research is already giving us to think upstream a bit more on prevention, and fascinating on some of those peer-led initiatives that are working and the evidence base around that. But then two really big questions around causes and prevalence, where whilst hypotheses around the role of poverty, and we need to address these things in wider public policy terms, actually there's a huge number of risk factors, and we need to improve our understanding. But most importantly of all, on the risks around social media, online harms, collectively as policymakers and academia, we need to really focus our energy and effort on improving our understanding there, but not ignoring, I think, those really hygiene factors of, well, we all know disrupted sleep is a bad thing, so social media at that time is there, as well as the obvious things around harmful content, so not allowing the need for more analysis to stop us focusing on those key things. Thank you to my brilliant panellists. If I can ask people to thank in the usual way.